You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Introducing Meta Ray-Ban Display, the world's most advanced AI glasses. With a full color display built into the lens of the glasses, it's there when you need it and gone when you don't. Send and receive messages, translate or caption live conversations, collaborate with Meta AI, and more. Be one of the first to try Meta Ray-Ban Display. Visit meta.com/Meta Ray-Ban Display to book a demo and find your pair.
Gold Bond knows that every glow-up starts with radiant skin. So choose Gold Bond Cocoa Butter Glow for a body lotion that's clinically shown to give you smooth, glowing skin. But don't just take our word for it. 88% of people who tried Gold Bond Cocoa Butter Glow saw glowing skin in just 1 day. Gold Bond Cocoa Butter Glow. Nourish your skin. Reveal your glow. Buy now on Amazon.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 236, After the Battle of Britain, Part 4, Conclusions and Continuations. This week, a big thank you goes out to Kyle for the donation through Ko-Fi, along with the funny message. Thank you, Kyle. And to Marco, Stuart, David, and Pamela for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. Also, for everybody listening, I'm trying to put together another question and answer episode, so if you have a question for me about anything related to the First or Second World War or the interwar years or anything in between, throw those over to historyofthesecondworldwar@gmail.com. That's historyofthesecondworldwar@gmail.com. There are a few important concepts to keep in mind when attempting to discuss the German air attacks on Britain from July 1940 until the postponement of the invasion plans in the middle of September. The first is that the Luftwaffe and the German military were not launching an attack against the RAF just to try and destroy them. They specifically wanted to degrade their fighting capabilities to the point where they could not respond to a German invasion. It is against that goal that the German efforts must be judged, which is a problem for the Luftwaffe because they were incredibly lofty goals that in retrospect they had no chance of actually achieving at any point in time. When it came down to the decision point in the middle of September, several crucial German leaders had already turned against the idea of an invasion, Admiral Raeder, the head of the German Navy, chief among them. And while at times Hitler would overrule any military leader if he wanted to, Hitler seems to have been just as much in doubt about the invasion by that stage as anyone else. He had also started to shift his eyes to other theaters. On the British side, their path to victory in the war was completely unclear, but their path to survival against the Luftwaffe was as clear as it could possibly be. They had, and it's not an exaggeration to say this, spent the last half of the 1930s planning for exactly the kind of campaign the Luftwaffe was planning and would execute in the summer of 1940. And when the British were confronted with that scenario, Fighter Command did very well. Just as importantly, so many other areas of Britain's war effort also rose to the occasion, with manufacturing, production, and civil services matching the efforts of the few in their Spitfires and Hurricanes. With all of that in mind, the easiest place to start our discussion of the campaign as a whole is by looking at numbers. There are two sets of numbers to discuss when it came to the battle. The first of these are the actual numbers of the aircraft that were damaged or destroyed during the fighting, and the actual number of pilots that were killed, wounded, or captured. Now, these exact numbers are actually a bit more fluid than you might expect, based specifically on when you start counting and when you end your count, with some histories starting during June and July, while others start as late as Eagle Day. And then the end date of the time period under discussion can also be a bit fuzzy, depending on whether or not you continue to count through September, October, and then the rest of the Blitz, or if you end at the end of September. There are also considerations around exactly which aircraft you count as part of the total, which is particularly straightforward on the German side, the Luftwaffe as a whole, but on the British side, there were Bomber Command and Coastal Command aircraft that were being lost throughout this entire period of time, but were not directly related to the Luftwaffe attacks on Britain. For example, they were bombing the barges that were going to be used in the invasion, or they were bombing targets on the continent. So how do you include those in your numbers? But enough disclaimers and considerations. The number of Luftwaffe aircraft lost was around 1,900, while on the RAF side, the number was around 1,600. The major reason for the larger Luftwaffe number was the fact that the German bombers were much more exposed to enemy actions and more vulnerable to British fighter attacks during the daytime raids. Bomber Command and Coastal Command on the British side also heavily featured bombing activity, but much of this was done at night, where the losses were generally much lower, even if that also meant that their actual bombs on target were much lower because they weren't great at hitting targets at night. But obviously, those raw numbers make it clear that the entire campaign did not go well for the Luftwaffe, even if you mess with the numbers a little bit due to uncertainty. This is because the Luftwaffe had started the campaign with the goal of neutralizing the RAF while retaining enough of their own strength to support the invasion. There were periods in the fighting when the exchange ratio was in the Luftwaffe's favor, and the exchange ratio just in fighters was often to the Luftwaffe's advantage, and it's only when the bomber numbers were added that the ratio decisively turns against the Germans. Unfortunately for the Luftwaffe, the Battle of Britain became a war of attrition for all aircraft types, and when it came to defeating fighter command and supporting the invasion, the bombers that they were losing were just as important as the fighters that were protecting them. But in some ways, the actual numbers, the ones that are important to us today, that are important to podcasts like this and history books, especially when looking at history from our kind of detached perspective, are actually far less important to the actual decision makers at the time than whatever numbers they thought were the actual numbers. Those decision makers were working off of estimated numbers of enemy aircraft destroyed, which for both sides was on a completely different level in terms of numbers. The issues for estimating enemy losses has been a major theme of the last several episodes of the podcast. It was a very important problem for the Germans as they tried to determine whether or not they were coming close to accomplishing their stated goal for the campaign, the destruction of the RAF. For the RAF, their estimates were similarly exaggerated, particularly near the end of the campaign, as they began to engage German raids with larger and larger groups of fighters. But for the British leaders, their estimates were generally less important when it came to decision-making. They were going to keep meeting the German raids as best they could, regardless of the lost ratios, so it didn't necessarily impact decision-making in that way. On both sides, the bad estimates did have important strategic implications, though, and the two that are important to highlight is the shift in German strategy away from their focus on fighter command bases, and on the British side, the evaluations on the tactics used by the various RAF fighter command groups, particularly around the idea of using a big wing style of attack. The Luftwaffe had started the campaign believing that they would only need 3 or 4 days to destroy fighter command. This was based on faulty intelligence around the number of fighters that the RAF had available to them at the time. The goal was to hit fighter command hard in the air and on their airfields, and then to shift the focus of the Luftwaffe groups or the bombing groups to other targets that were more important to the invasion. When the estimated fighter command losses were compared with the expected starting number, it seemed that things were going quite well during those very early days. This meant that starting in late August, it seemed reasonable for there to be a subtle shift away from the fighter command airfields that had been the focus up to that point and towards other targets, like the bombing of London and other industrial areas. The decision to shift was also accelerated by the accidental bombing of London on August 24th and the RAF Bomber Command's reprisal raids of various German cities. In retrospect, this is seen as a major mistake by the Luftwaffe, and in some ways it was, but they were also never having the impact that they wanted or needed to have during their airfield attacks and on the airfields that they were targeting, making it unlikely that they would have somehow completed their campaign objectives even if they would have put complete focus on those airfields throughout the campaign. On the British side, their bad estimates, particularly later in the campaign, would play a major role in the debates around the best way to respond to the German raids, with Lee Mallory and 12 Group using heavily exaggerated numbers as part of their case for why their tactics were superior, their big wing tactics were superior. Park and 11 Group were concerned that the numbers were not accurate, but there was only so much they could do to argue against the estimates. By inflating the effectiveness of his squadrons, Lee-Mallory had a much easier job making the case that his tactics were actually better, causing the eventual dismissal of Park from 11 Group. While aircraft losses were important for both sides, aircraft are also very replaceable. There were constant sort of attrition and churn in aircraft due to accidents, due to mechanical issues, so losing aircraft was expected. That's why you had factories making more. It could take some time to make a Spitfire, but a Spitfire is always a Spitfire. A 109 is always a 109. But it was much more difficult to replace the pilots that were lost during the fighting. In total, there would be about 2,700 total Luftwaffe losses. The British would take around 1,000 of those prisoners between July and October, and they were often sent off to Canada for the duration of the war, preventing any kind of escape attempt. One of the interesting features of these prisoners that were taken was how few of them had started their training after the start of the war in September 1939. One of the features of the run of success that the Luftwaffe would have between the invasion of Poland and the defeat of France was that they experienced very little attrition within their fighter and bomber groups. This meant that by the time they were flying over Britain, they were generally very highly experienced, particularly when compared with the British pilots who had fewer chances to gain real combat experience. For these pre-war pilots, Britain would be one long attrition event as day after day they made the long flights across the Channel and then engaged with British fighters. In many ways, the quality of Luftwaffe pilots would never really recover from this experience, with the cadres of experienced pilots no longer available to share their hard-earned knowledge with those that were being brought into the service over the course of the rest of the war. There were still great victories in the future, of incredible destruction totals in the skies and on the airfields of Russia. Their totals there would become legendary. But that was primarily preying on a weaker enemy, not one that was of similar quality, like what they experienced and what they had to fight against with the RAF Fighter Command over Britain. Hey guys, millions of men have problems with ED every year. Maybe that's you. Maybe you don't want to talk about it because nobody wants to talk about it, but it happens, and RexMD is here to help. RexMD is a licensed provider of ED medication, and it starts with just a short, simple quiz to help determine the best path forward for you. Everybody is different. There are no one-size-fits-all treatments, but RexMD has all of the options. Oh, and after some private consultations, your personal treatment arrives directly to your door in discreet packaging. You are not alone. RexMD has been chosen by 475,000 men. So if you need to be ready when the mood strikes, head on over to rexmd.com/SWW to get up to 95% off your ED treatment. See full details and usage at rexmd.com. Prescription required. Results may vary. Visit rexmd.com/SWW and get up to 95% off your ED treatment. Thank you, RexMD, for sponsoring this episode.
Shaq here, spinning fast-acting pain relief with Icy Hot. Ice works fast, heat makes it last. Icy Hot, you're so back.
There are two questions that must be asked about the Luftwaffe efforts against Britain in the summer and early autumn of 1940. How close did they get to succeeding, and why did they fail to achieve their goals? We can start with how close they came to their goal, which again was to destroy RAF Fighter Command as a fighting force that could impact the invasion plans while also retaining enough Luftwaffe strength to support the invasion. To quote Stephen Bungay from The Most Dangerous Enemy, a pivotal source for this series of episodes, who is here referencing Theo Osterkamp, one of the German fighter pilots who took part in the fighting. Quote, "The fundamental dilemma facing the German fighter pilots had been recognized by Osterkamp right from the start. They needed a very high kill ratio, which meant selecting only favorable opportunities. But they also needed a high absolute level of kills, which meant using every opportunity for fighting." End quote. The importance of the kill ratio maintained by the Germans cannot be overstated, and throughout the battle they really struggled to maintain it, particularly when bombers were taken into account. We already discussed numbers earlier in this episode, but the key problem for the Germans was simply that they were unable to destroy the British fighters fast enough, particularly later in the campaign as British factories continued to increase the speed at which they were building new fighters. This meant that as the campaign wore on, the Germans were simply losing the battle of attrition and were unable to replace the losses that they were suffering, even as the RAF would actually be getting stronger. Many histories will point to the decision discussed just a moment ago, the shift from a campaign focused on bombing British airfields and instead focusing on other targets as the cause for this failure. But there's a lot of evidence that the decision did not actually change the calculus of the campaign. The best source for this is from Air Marshal Dowding himself, who was leading fighter command throughout the course of the battle. Throughout the battle, he was of course getting reports from the various air groups discussing the course of the campaign as they saw it and their current state and what they looked forward to in the future. One of these was from 11 Group's Park, which covered the first month of the fighting from 8th of August to the 10th of September. This included the entire time during which the Luftwaffe was focused on destroying fighter command both in the air and on the ground. And here is Dowding's response to that report. Quote, "I agree with the air officer commanding 11 Group that the damage done by air attack to aerodromes has been serious, and that it was beginning at one time to affect materially the efficiency of our fighter operations. Nevertheless, I must point out that 13 aerodromes in the group underwent a total of over 40 attacks over 3 weeks, but Manston and Lympne were the only two that were unfit for flying for more than a few hours. That although the scale of attack certainly exceeded the capacity of the works organization existing at the outset, this was rapidly strengthened, and I do not wish to express any dissatisfaction with the measures taken to effect this improvement." End quote. The works organization he's talking about there is the repair sort of groups that were at the airfields that were repairing the German damage done as quickly as possible. That response from Dowdy makes it clear to me at least that he never felt that the Germans got close to degrading Fighter Command's ability to respond to their raids, and really was never even close to removing 11 Group from the board, which would have had to have been the first domino to fall. The greatest damage was caused late in August, with the raids focused on some of the sector stations like Biggin Hill or Kinley. But even in those raids, which did cause damage to those airfields, the ratio of losses was far from favorable for the Germans. Even if they would have continued, it would have been very costly to put in the number of raids required to cause real long-term damage, which would have caused them to fail in the key second pillar of the campaign, which was to retain enough strength to support Sea Lion. So if the Luftwaffe did not get close to succeeding in their goals, the next obvious question is why they were unable to make it happen. At the very beginning of this series, I already gave my opinion on this, but to review, the Luftwaffe failed in their goals during the Battle of Britain because what they were attempting to do was fundamentally beyond their capabilities. Every air force during the interwar years, without exception, and including the Luftwaffe and the Royal Air Force, did not understand the amount of effort and the scale of the bombing campaign that would be required to have a decisive impact during a strategic bombing campaign. This caused them to overestimate the impact that their forces, or the forces they had available to them, could have on the enemy in a situation in which only air power was being used, instead of just air power as a complement to ground forces. For the Battle of Britain, this resulted in the Luftwaffe spreading itself way too thin and trying to do too much without enough focus on one specific target and one specific area. This might have been workable if the Luftwaffe had more aircraft or if it had more time, but both of those were very finite resources. The timing window for the invasion was fixed even before the air campaign started, and there were many days in which the weather did not allow for air operations. This narrow timing window, where they had to win before the middle of September, made it impossible to extend any piece of the campaign, and in my mind, made it impossible for the entire endeavor to succeed. Obviously, the British took actions that made it worse for the Luftwaffe, and one of the most important was the decision throughout the campaign to focus the vast majority of fighter command strength on the German bombers. What the German Luftwaffe fighter groups really wanted to do was to engage in fighter versus fighter actions, without the bombers present to slow them down and put them out of position. But Park in particular made sure his sector leaders knew that they were to avoid strictly fighter versus fighter action as much as possible. This was taken to such an extreme that if a German raid was known to only contain fighters, the British aircraft would sometimes just stay on their airfields. This frustrated the Luftwaffe's attempts to engage the British aircraft under the most favorable circumstances, and at the point where they could achieve the largest kill ratios, which was generally, again, when their bombers were not involved. Another thing to keep in mind is that behind the scenes in most histories, but very much front of mind for both British and German leaders, was the German plans for an invasion. On September 17th, with the failures of the German attack on September 15th, Battle of Britain Day, Sea Lion was postponed until the spring of 1941. However, it was unclear to the British that the invasion had been called off for 1940, and so there were still some concerns that it was going to happen. The British were essentially seeing phantom preparations throughout October and November. And in some ways, German preparations for a spring 1941 invasion would continue, with actual dedicated landing craft being developed and built, which would have resulted in the German forces having access to purpose-built landing craft that would have not been present for their 1940 efforts. The spring of 1941 would have also worked better for the German Navy. During 1940, the Kriegsmarine, and Admiral Raeder as its leader, were very concerned about the ability of the German air and sea forces to protect the invasion from the Royal Navy. In September 1940, due to the damage sustained by the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the largest ships available to the invasion, there was simply only heavy cruisers and smaller that would have been actually present at sea during an invasion. There's very little that any of the German ships could have done against the numbers and power of the Royal Navy ships that could have been brought to bear. But by the spring of 1941, the situation at sea had greatly shifted. The Scharnhorst and Gneisenau could be made available, and just as importantly, the new battleship, Bismarck, would also have been ready for action. This would have completely changed the force comparisons at sea. The British had also been building, of course. They'd greatly increased the strength of their coastal forces, particularly in the area of motor gunboats, which were perfect against invasion flotillas, like the ones that the Germans would have, because they had 20mm and 40mm guns, along with search radars for night interception. All of these changes meant that the war at sea during an invasion in 1941 would have looked very different in a lot of ways that are deeply difficult to predict. But for the German leaders, their focus had already shifted, first to the Balkans in April, and then to an attack on the Soviet Union in June. And so the invasion was never revisited as a real option during 1941, or for the rest of the war, given how things would go in Russia. While the Luftwaffe had failed in their attempts to curtail RAF strength during the summer and autumn of 1940, on the British side there was of course much to celebrate. It had seemed like the British Isles were at their greatest risk of invasion since the days of Napoleon, and they'd been able to fight it off. And it was a nationwide victory, with everyone playing an important role in the struggle, from the fighter pilots that became legendary heroes, to the grounds crew that kept them in the air, to workers in the factory that were building their aircraft, to random citizens who did not panic when the bombing shifted to civilian targets. And while this was a victory, it was about as far from a final victory as was possible. Britain did not win the war in the Battle of Britain. They barely managed to not lose the war, which was still an accomplishment, but the war was far from won. But instead of the events over Britain causing both sides to move towards any kind of peace agreements, they instead would find themselves in a war that was growing to a scale beyond anything previously imagined. Many eyes turned towards the Mediterranean as the fighting between the British and Italians continued to expand in scope and ferocity. German eyes were of course already turning east with their great struggle with the Soviet Union to begin during the summer months, but only after there was a Balkan diversion. It is reasonable to claim that until 1941, the Second World War was not truly a world war, confined to a few areas of Europe, North Africa, and Asia. But 1941 would change that, and it would become the largest conflict of all time. One final comment on the Battle of Britain, though. Every historical event goes through a process over the decades that shifts how it is viewed and the impact it has on those that experienced it and then those that come after. The Battle of Britain is no different. It's one of the foundational moments of modern Britain, with allusions to the Blitz spirit and a unique ability to persevere under harsh conditions of keeping calm and carrying on, being an important legacy to British society. And for many decades, those that lived through the events of the war were able to pass down those memories and those experiences. Some were forgotten, some perhaps grew in the telling, but they were still an important part of the legacy of the event. But as the decades passed, those that watched the few of Fighter Command battle it out over Britain, or who survived the bombing of the Blitz, have passed away. In March 2025, the last combat pilot of the RAF who fought in the Battle of Britain passed away at the age of 105. Those that survived the event, even as children, will not be far behind. And this represents an important shift in how modern people remember and understand the events of the past. Once it moves out of living memory, once those who experienced it have passed on, it begins to transition into the legendary past. This has already happened for the Battle of Britain, and its exact impact on the war, its impact on the RAF and the Luftwaffe, on the citizens of Germany and Britain, the actual history doesn't actually matter. It is the famous speeches, the questionably reported aerial heroics, and everyday stories of keeping calm and carrying on that remain, outside and without regard sometimes for exact historical events. But with the benefit of hindsight, and when setting aside emotion, it's easy to see the Battle of Britain as just one small story in the great saga of the Second World War, and there were no illusions about the situation that Britain found itself in after it had fought off the possible German invasion, after its finest hour. On October 8th, Churchill would give one of his many updates on the war situation to the House of Commons, discussing the night bombing raids, actions in North Africa, and other events. I will read the end of his speech here in full because I think it does a good job of sort of summarizing the path that Britain had in front of it here in October 1940. Quote, "Because we feel easier in ourselves and see our way more clearly through our difficulties and dangers than we did some months ago, because foreign countries, friends or foes, recognize the giant, enduring, resilient strength of Britain and the British Empire, do not let us dull for one moment the sense of the awful hazards in which we stand. Do not let us lose the conviction that it is only by supreme and superb exertions, unwearying and indomitable, that we shall save our souls alive. No one can predict, no one can even imagine how terrible this war against German and Nazi aggression will run its course, or how far it will spread, or how long it will last. Long, dark months of trials and tribulations lie before us. Not only great dangers, but many more misfortunes, many shortcomings, many mistakes, many disappointments will surely be our lot. Death and sorrow will be the companions on our journey, hardship our garment, constancy and valor our only shield. We must be united, we must be undaunted, we must be inflexible. Our qualities and deeds must burn and glow through the gloom of Europe until they become the veritable beacon of its salvation." End quote. For the British Empire and its people, there is a very long road ahead, and the podcast will begin to walk down that road starting in just a few weeks, when we begin to focus on the events in the Mediterranean, which would occupy much of the British war effort for the better part of 2 years. The British did not win the war during the Battle of Britain. The Germans did not lose the war during the Battle of Britain. But the road to victory and defeat would continue on the waters of the Mediterranean and in the sands of North Africa.